I'll call the meeting to order. We do have a quorum. I better turn to the right agenda here. Just about reprised the November meeting. I'd like to go around the table and have introductions, and then also with other guests. So can we start with you, Randy?
Yes, Randy Elliott, Davis County.
Ann Neville, the Nature Conservancy.
Ryan Doherty, Tooele County.
Marissa Weinberg, Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
Don Leonard with the Great Salt Lake Brine Shrimp Cooperative.
Waylon Myers with Publicly Owned Treatment Works. Joe Havasey, Extractive Industries.
Thank you. Tim?
Morning, everybody. Tim Davis. I'm the Deputy Great Salt Lake Commission.
Stephanie Graham, SWCA.
R. Jeffrey Hicks, the Airboat Association, and
Marcel Schub, National Audubon Society.
John Morrison, Jacobs Engineering Group.
Sam Shredz, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Jeff Denblaker, Jacobs.
Jaimi Butler, I'm with SWCA right now.
Dan Strout, working with the Utah Audubon Council.
Mark Reynolds, U.S. Magnesium.
Tim Hawks with the Brine Shrimp Co-op.
Jamie Barnes, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
Ben Starman, also Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
Jack Ray, the Utah Waterfowl Association.
Lily Wetterlin, SWCA.
We good? Well, thank you everyone for being here. We have quite a few people joining us online, so thank you for your participation, including a couple of members. The agenda was provided to you about a week ago, and I think it was sent out actually twice. And so we didn't receive any requests for agenda items or changes to the agenda, so I'd entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Thank you, Leland.
And second.
And second. And thank you. Any debate or discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? Any abstentions? It's unanimous. We also provided a copy of meeting notes of our November 8, 2023 meeting. We received no requests for corrections or changes to those notes, so I'd entertain a motion to approve them.
Move.
Thank you, Leland. Thank you, Randy. Any debate or discussion? All in favor say aye or raise your hand if you're participating online and we can see you.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? It's unanimous. We have a busy agenda as always, and looking forward to the presentations we'll receive. Our first item on the agenda is the Great Salt Lake Enhancement Projects final report. Lily Wetterlin, Stephanie Graham, and Jaimi Butler will be making the presentation. By way of introduction, about the middle of last year, Director Ferry had some conversations with a number of people about the need for a list of potential Great Salt Lake projects to consider when federal, state, local, or private funds are available. We were approached by the state about partnering and funding and developing such a list. The Advisory Council approved our participation as co-sponsors with the Division of Water Resources and the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. Each of the three co-sponsors paid 1/3 of the cost. A state bid process resulted in the selection of SWCA with some independent contractors on their team. The report was recently completed, and we have with us today Lily Wetterlin, who will be the main presenter. Stephanie Graham and Jaimi Butler are also here to help answer questions. So Lily, are we ready to rock and roll here?
Perfect. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here today. My name is Lily Wetterlin. I'm working with SWCA Environmental Consultants as a water resource scientist. And we've been collaboratively working with the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, and Division of Water Resources on the Great Salt Lake Enhancement projects. Other people from SWCA have also been working on this. Jaimi Butler in the room and Stephanie Graham, as well as Erica Gaddis. I know she's online. But today I'll be giving an overview of the project. Okay, so as most of you know, the Great Salt Lake is the largest saline lake in the Western Hemisphere, connecting people, land, water, and food. The lake is essential to Utah's climate, economy, and provides critical habitat for migratory birds. The lake has undergone drying over the last few decades with wide-ranging ecological, economic, and public health effects. While there are several efforts underway to develop long-term solutions for the lake, there are immediate projects that could be implemented to protect lake levels and habitat in the short term. The Great Salt Lake Enhancement projects aim to gather information from a diverse range of stakeholders on proposed projects that could increase water delivery, improve or conserve habitat, or provide other tangible benefits to the lake. The overall goal of the project was to develop a master list or a database of these implementation projects that could further be used to leverage stakeholder collaboration or identify eligible projects when funding becomes available. So to gather all this information for these master list and database, we collected information through interviews, and key stakeholders, and we developed a list of questions to gather information for the database. We also created an online survey through Survey 123 software, and this was developed so that we could expand the project reach further than those that were interviewed. We also held a stakeholder workshop back here in October. I recognize some faces from that meeting, but this was also a really great opportunity to expand the project reach and bring stakeholders together to learn about the purpose of this project, learn about what other key stakeholders are working on, and hopefully develop collaboration. Oh, no worries. Oh, thanks. So there were a lot of stakeholders involved throughout this whole process, from academics, commissions and councils, duck clubs, state and federal agencies, and a lot more that we could name. They all surround the Great Salt Lake and have a lot of important input to providing benefits for the lake, and also lots of projects in the works. From all of these interviews, survey, and workshop, we compiled 161 projects into the database. So the project database is this master list of projects, and it is currently compiled into an Excel document. This Excel document holds valuable information such as what agencies are involved with each project, who to contact from those agencies, project descriptions of the project. We also develop project tags, which I'll go into more detail in the coming slides, but these tags were developed so that we could filter the database based on project category and also benefits to the lake. We also collected information on project cost, so estimates on what the cost of the project to be implemented would be if any funding has been identified or acquired. We also collected information on project requirements for planning. So that included what other stakeholders need to be involved in these projects, any project dependencies, any project duplication that may occur, what information or data gaps are missing for these projects, and also any anticipated regulatory or permitting barriers. So today is more of a general overview of what is in the database. We're not getting into any project specifics, but we'll be going over how we tagged some of these projects and how they're categorized through the database and how this can help us utilize this database. So first, each project was put within a category, such as water delivery, which could be water conveyance projects, water conservation, which agricultural optimization could fall under, or municipal and industrial water conservation programs. Infrastructure such as waterfowl management, such as development of levees, dams, habitat conservation and restoration, which could include enhancement of Great Salt Lake wetlands or restoration further up in the watershed, such as the Bear River. Research assessment and monitoring. So there's a lot of information that could be still needed for groundwater monitoring, bird surveys, water quality, air quality. In-lake engineered solutions, which could include projects related to, engineering designs, changes on the causeway. And then policy and community engagement, which could include projects looking for lobbying or educational programs related to the lake or conservation. Overall, each of these projects was also put into a bucket on status. So conceptual, planned, shovel-ready, or in progress. So a conceptual project, it's still kind of in the works, in the planning phases. People are thinking about these really great ideas. Planned has some more, planned components. They might know more estimates on cost, who needs to be involved to make this project happen. Shovel ready, that project's ready to hit the ground running as soon as possible. They might just be waiting on certain things such as funding. And then we also have in progress projects, and a lot of these made it into the database because they're ongoing. They might have additional phases or still need further information to keep these projects going. So within the database, we found that a lot of these projects actually fell into research, assessment, and monitoring, which really shows that there's a lot of information that stakeholders are still interested in gathering from the lake. And about 50% of these were in the conceptual phase. So again, lots of thoughts going on about what information we still need to learn about the lake. And then the other 30% was in progress. So lots of ongoing monitoring efforts still underway. The in-lake engineered solutions had the lowest amount of projects in the database. And then we also observed that a lot of projects in the planned phases fell under water delivery, water conservation, or infrastructure. We also tagged these projects in the database based on their primary benefit. Over half of the projects, really their primary benefit was directed towards Great Salt Lake levels or habitat. And then again, a lot of these projects are directed at gathering more data and information surrounding the lake. All of the projects too were tagged based on where they fell in geographic limit within the Great Salt Lake Basin. So less than 50% of the projects fell into Great Salt Lake adjacent, which is defined as the meander line. And then this project did extend its reaches into the Bear River, Weber River, and Jordan River watersheds, as well as the headwaters. Overall, Bear River and Jordan River watersheds had the highest amount of projects outside of the Great Salt Lake adjacent. And then about 11% of the projects were actually statewide or laboratory based, so they didn't necessarily fall into a watershed. And then 4% of the projects fell into multiple watersheds. We really wanted to connect these projects to strategies and recommendations that have already been developed. So we tagged the projects based on the 12 water strategies that was developed by the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council and the Great Salt Lake Steering Group, HCR 10 recommendations. And the goal of these recommendations are really to ensure adequate flow to the lake. So we wanted to tie this project database and enable us to filter based on these priorities. We found that most of the projects related closely to ag water conservation or watershed best practices and improving information and decision making. Within the database, we also worked with stakeholders throughout this process on gathering as much information as we could on the estimated costs to complete these projects. Because so many of these projects are in the conceptual phase, there's still a lot of unknowns on costs, planning, et cetera. So only 74 of the 161 projects in the database provided costs. So these are some just broad statistics on these costs. But the range for a project to be implemented ranged from $15,000 to $230 million. but that was a little skewed. The median fell around 1 million. So the total cost of those 74 projects was just over $600 million. We also asked stakeholders to provide any information on if they've had any funding secured. Some projects did have partial funding, million, so just over had been secured. And then from that, we calculated what was remaining to be funding, which is approximately 80% of those projects still have funding requirements, which is just over 500 million. Again, I want to preface that a lot of these projects weren't able to provide costs, so these are just general estimates on what we're looking at so far. Diving into those estimated costs, since 15,000 to 230 million is quite a range. 50% of the projects actually fell under 1 million, and only 10% fell above 10 million. So overall, some key things we noticed from the projects overall in this database is that there were a lot of projects that fell under research, assessment, and monitoring. And from the workshop, we definitely learned that there's still a lot of stakeholders that are really interested in learning more about the Great Salt Lake. You know, there's still a lot to know to develop some of these models and other implementation plans that are in the works. We also learned that, you know, a little over half of these projects are not Great Salt Lake adjacent. So we really need to be looking at those Bear River, Jordan River, and Weber River watersheds for additional projects. They have a big influence on the strategies that are needed to protect the lake. And then a lot of these projects fell into the planned or conceptual phase. So there's still more details needed to be worked out. A lot of these projects, you know, have a lot of funding requirements that haven't been met. They're still investigating funding and still a lot of unknowns. And then from the database of the projects that did provide costs, again, a lot of funding is still needed from this estimate, 80%. So this database can really serve as a lot of tools for stakeholders and other agencies interested. We can use it to allocate funding for eligible projects as funding becomes available. It can be used to leverage stakeholder collaboration and connections on projects. Kind of gives an idea of what people are working on and who you can work with. We can also think to use this database for bundling projects. Combining projects for strategic funding opportunities and also possibly enhancing implementation. Really working, bringing stakeholders together will bring these projects to success. I'd like to thank the project advisory team, which included Don Leonard, Marissa Weinberg, Laura Vernon, and Ben Steierman. They were really great to work with, and SWCA really enjoyed working with you throughout this process. You provided really great insight, and I think we're all really happy with the outcome. And then thanks for the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council for having us here today. And thanks, a really, really big thanks for all the stakeholders who were involved in this room, online, and those that aren't attending. We wouldn't have been able to create this database or list without you. And we will take questions. I'll also note that Jaimi and Stephanie and Dawn and Marissa are able to chime in if I'm unable to answer anything.
Thank you, Lily. Appreciate the presentation. That's excellent. Leland, you had a question?
Was there any attempt to prioritize the projects to see if you're going to use it for funding? Is there a prioritization in the study, or is it just this is the bulk of it and somebody else gets to prioritize it?
That is a really great question and something we talked about a lot throughout this process. As of now, there's no prioritization, but I'm sure as this moves forward, that's something that will be considered.
So as an auxiliary question, can a lot of the projects be thrown out because they're pie in the sky?
I definitely am not one to, I guess, make that call. So that would be, you know, up to the committee and kind of looking through that database in more detail.
Leland, one of my favorite desserts is pie, so we're not throwing any pie out. I can tell you that. I think in terms of the prioritization question, let me comment on that. As you recall, when we did the 72 strategies for getting water to the Great Salt Lake, we didn't ask our contractor to prioritize those. We came back later as a council and prioritized them on our own. And we thought that we weren't in a position yet to create a criteria for our contractor to be able to effectively prioritize them. So I think we might come back and do that as a group.
Yeah, really great question.
Other questions or comments? Go ahead, Jeff.
I echo that. I think there is a great need to prioritize and develop a criteria of how to get the biggest bang for the buck. Because some of the small projects may do a lot more than some of the more expensive. I think that's absolutely needed. The other thing that I would ask is once these projects are implemented, how are they actually measured to their effectiveness going forward? It seems like you also need to measure projects after they're implemented, what they actually achieve.
That is,
Oops, go ahead.
I'll let you speak. I was going to say I don't have the answer for that since it's not within our scope, but it's definitely something to consider. So I'll let you go.
Right, and I would, Jeff, I really like your ask because I'd like to add to that as far as how that applies to different agencies' mandates or, policies that they're, how that the projects help them meet their needs. And I really feel like the different agencies could help out going through these different projects, and they probably contributed. I'm assuming that they contributed too. Yeah.
Thank you, Ann. Tim had a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to address the earlier question about quantification and looking at the actual benefits of, I'm getting old, so my glasses are, never know which way to go. The Great Salt Lake Strategic Plan, which Commissioner Steed will talk about soon, we specifically call that out. And how do we measure benefit of different types of projects? I will say, for my part, as the Deputy Commissioner, I have not dived into all of the projects yet in the list, but that is something that we're specifically calling out over the next year, really developing the tools, the metrics to be able to measure benefits of projects in the Great Salt Lake Basin. And going back to and working with all the agencies, whether it's Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, Division of Water Rights, Division of Water Resources, I'm going to just try to name everybody, Division of Water Quality and others, and really working with those agencies to make sure that we're measuring benefits for their mandates as well within the lake. So we're looking at that, and I think that's an important step of any of these projects. What benefit do they have to the lake, and how, and what portion of the lake, what aspect of it? So thanks.
Thank you, Tim. Other questions or comments?
Mr. Chair, you have a comment online from Tom Ward.
Tom, fire away.
Actually, Tim and Leland and Jeff addressed my same thought as a ranking criteria of both the efficacy of the project to help the lake, and then maybe starting with, as Tim was alluding to, the primary objectives of our efforts, which are the biggest losses. If the lake is going to dry up, then everything else is moot. So that's maybe priority one. And so Tim, as you and others and we as an advisory board are looking at this, what I'm hearing is establishing some criteria, maybe a matrix, like the Great Salt Lake matrix that establishes the health of the lake under different parameters based upon the level of the lake. We can look at these projects and decide which ones are critical, and there might be a whole bunch of them that really we'd rather save our money for the most important things, at least at this stage of lake management. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Other comments or questions? From the comments, I can tell we've got some good follow-up on this project, and we'll look into how we can develop some criteria and do some prioritization. Okay, thank you very much, Lily. That was terrific.
Thank you.
I'd like to take the opportunity to switch a couple of things on our agenda. Brian Steed is running just a little bit late, and so I think we'll jump to the Great Salt Lake Legislative update from Tim Hawks. Thank you for being flexible here, Tim.
See if I can figure it out. Thanks, Don. Good morning, everybody. Give me a second to try to get this up. So it's, I work for the Brine Shrimp Cooperative, but for 8 years I served in the state legislature, and I have a little bit of PTSD this time of year. The session starts next week, and so what's amazing to me is just how not stressed I feel at the moment, and grateful for that. But one of the downsides of that is, did anybody experience the snow squall last night? You see that? So leaving the legislature is a little bit like stepping into a snow squall, because your visibility goes from, several miles to nothing really quickly. So you'll see that a little bit in this presentation. But it's good to be with you and talk about some important things that are happening. Before I get into some of the bills that are going on, just a little bit of explanation, or just a reminder that the state has this incredible website, le.utah.gov. When I was a legislator, I would access this dozens of times a day as a legislator, because the inside tools didn't work as well as this one. So you can get on there, you can type in Great Salt Lake, you can do lots of different things, pull up bills, you can see how the bills, what the debates are, who voted, yes or no. I mean, it's really a powerful site. And one of the things you can do is sign up for bill tracking. So if some of the bills that I mention are of interest to you, you can log on, you have to register with the website, and anytime there's a change in the status of that bill, the website will send you a notification. So it's really quite a powerful tool. If you haven't spent a lot of time on it, I'd encourage you to spend some time on it. You'll learn a lot that way. Knowledge is power. So let me just view from 10,000 feet, thinking about the session. I think it's important to realize that a lot of the important policy levers or tools have been put in place. There's a lot of tools in the toolbox to help this Great Salt Lake. But all of these tools take a lot of time to implement. And we're really kind of in the implementation phase. So sometimes people are like, well, I expect to see a dozen more bills on the Great Salt Lake. Really, we're into implementation phase on a lot of this stuff. And so what you're going to see in terms of the bills is more kind of tweaks and refinements than major new pieces of legislation. So that's just kind of an overarching perspective, and I think that will likely hold true for much of the bills we'll talk about, and just for the session as a whole. So, and I think the bills I'm going to mention are going to fall into that pattern. So the first one I wanted to mention is water modifications by Senator Scott Sandel. This is a really important bill, and it deals with something we've talked about for years called agricultural water optimization, which is a mouthful, but the idea is if we find conservation, we're able to conserve water in the agricultural sector, right, in a way that allows that agricultural water to be shared. And if we think about a long-term vision for Great Salt Lake, we have to find ways to share water more effectively. And one of the ways we can do that is by partnering with the agricultural community in ways that make sure that the water can be shared. In specifically what SB 18 does, it's a follow-up to, I think it was Senate Bill 277 from the last session. It talks about quantifying, identifying the amount of water that's saved in an agricultural water optimization or conservation project, and then how is that water right recognized under the law, and then how can it be shepherded, which is the term we use a lot, but how can it be shepherded from the top of the watershed down to a lot of water stakeholders have been spending an enormous amount of time to try to figure out what that is. How do we make that work within our system of water law? And this bill does that. So you're going to see clear definitions and legal protections. And ultimately, this is a really important bill. And I think Senator Sandel and all the folks that have been working on this deserve a lot of credit because it's hard to see a future for the lake where we don't figure this bit out. Representative Ward came up with an interesting bill recently that gives Brine more things to do because Brine doesn't have enough on his plate already. But what it said is, and it is really kind of an interesting idea, and this is from, Representative Ward does not work all the time on lake issues, but he's sort of sitting back and as a legislator, and he's seen this drum roll of different things that we're doing. And he's sort of saying, so what does that do for the lake? Agricultural optimization, we've invested $250 million there. Water banking, the state's been doing water banking now, or at least had the legal framework in place since 2020. What's being done there? Watershed Enhancement Trust and secondary metering, another big investment by the state, hundreds of millions of dollars invested by the state. And so Representative Ward said, hey, let's have the Great Salt Lake Commissioner tell us what each of these projects has done to benefit the lake. It's an interesting idea, right? And I think it's being worked out because I think conceptually we like that idea. The challenge is that it's really hard today to sort of go out and quantify outside of the work that the trust is doing. Marcel, thank you very much. And everybody's working on the trust. It's really hard to quantify specific benefits to say, hey, ag optimization has resulted in X in Great Salt Lake, or secondary metering has resulted in Y in Great Salt Lake. But getting us thinking about it and quantifying and identifying the savings is really key. And so it's kind of an interesting, we'll see, this one's being morphed and moved around. But the concept is, again, like I said, refinements on what we've done already. The next one, a little bit interesting. This is from Speaker Mike Schultz, Great Salt Lake Mineral Extraction Amendments. It's a bit loaded, so this is just a bill title without any content in it. And maybe, I don't know, Joe and Mark are here, maybe you got better line of sight to it, but it is interesting when you see the Speaker of the House, number one, he doesn't run a lot of bills. Speakers typically don't run a lot of bills. We just get the title out there. We don't know what it is exactly. My guess is it's a follow-up in some way on last session's legislation regarding mineral extraction industries on the lake, royalty rates and how's all that stuff administered and what happens in times of shortage and things like that. Joe, I don't know if you have anything to add or any clear line of sight, but I think it's probably some kind of follow-up based on that. But it is a Great Salt Lake specific bill, which is why I wanted to call it out. Sounds like, yeah, same.
Farmington, please speak into the mic.
Yeah, was that, I think they were asking you to speak into the mic, Joe, because couldn't hear.
Yeah, I don't have any updates at this time, Tim. Hopefully before the session, we can get a summary of contents of the bill.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Didn't mean to put you on the spot. It is kind of, this happens a lot, though. Legislators will simply release the title of the bill, and it's a little bit of a surprise. You don't know exactly what's in it until the text actually drops. Representative Doug Owens has a couple of interesting bills. I've decided to do them under one bullet. But the first one, water efficient landscaping amendments, he says, hey, within the Great Salt Lake watershed, if you're a public school and it's a new public school, or if you're doing a major renovation that meets a certain criteria, then it limits how much turf you can use, how much grass you can use on the landscape, which I think is a great idea. And some similar requirements for state buildings. There's another bill that has not been released, but he's been working on. It's called Water Usage Amendments. This really deals with what we might call shoulder season water. So this is water that's used in the spring and in the fall, and often we put it on our lawns when the lawns don't really need it because it's early enough in the season. There's enough water there for the grass, or late in the season, same sort of issue. And so there's an effort to sort of say, hey, let's not have people effectively wasting water when it's not going to do anybody any good. We'd rather have that water in a reservoir or downstream to Great Salt Lake. So a couple of interesting bills from Representative Owens. And then I wanted to just mention some indirectly related bills. In other words, they don't have a direct impact on Great Salt Lake, but they might have an indirect impact. Representative Casey Snyder is working on, it has the telling title of water-related changes. But effectively what he's trying to do is to replicate for water infrastructure funding. You can think about all the piping and dams and stuff that delivers our water supply, to replicate what's done for roads, and just in terms of the planning process and how projects are identified and prioritized and things like that. So he wants to really centralize that, and there's some sense to that. but again, could have an effect on some of these issues like Great Salt Lake. Representative Benyon has one that she's been working on over the summer called riparian amendments. This is really designed to get local governments to deal with riparian areas and protecting riparian corridors in their general plans. It's meeting some friction and some resistance, but she's done a lot of work with stakeholders to try to move that forward. And Representative Ballard has, I believe, has a bill on, she typically does most sessions on water usage and water reporting, I think for schools, but I'm not sure exactly who she wants to have reporting that data. And then Representative Carl Albrecht, House Bill 61. So this is a numbered bill that's been released. They say you can't really manage what you can't measure. And so one of the real key things, and I think Commissioner Steed will talk about this, we have to be able to do a better job of measuring and quantifying water, whether it's saved water, how water is being used and diverted to various uses. And so one of the pushes, and this bill helps do this, is by encouraging water accounting and telemetry and things like that. So the bill's designed to encourage that and create rulemaking or authorize rulemaking around that. That's basically it for the bills. There will inevitably be other bills that pop up during the session. There might be folks here that are aware of some that I haven't mentioned. Just because legislators, they can drop, the biggest single limitation of bills is just getting the bill drafted in the first instance. So there are a lot of ideas out there that may not have been drafted just yet. Let me just mention that I think it's too early to really talk about appropriations requests, but there are some appropriation requests in the works. I think in the governor's budget, there's some money or some requested money to support the commissioner's office and initiatives that might run through the commissioner's office. There's some discussion of additional money for the Great Salt Lake Trust, really to help fund wetland projects. Let me just say that when we talk about the money that's given to the trust, if the need for the Great Salt Lake is, well, from the floor to the ceiling, the 40 million that the state allocated is about that much. So the needs are much greater, whether you're talking about wetlands, and certainly when you're talking about water to the Great Salt Lake, the needs are great. So anyway, we'll probably see some appropriations requests on the lake this year. Budgets are a little bit tighter this year, but there's still some one-time funding out there. And so I'm optimistic that we'll see some funding flow to some important things. And that's all I got.
Thank you, Tim. We have time for one or two questions. And Leland, you're up first.
Okay, so, we're talking about how to shepherd water from agricultural conservation to the lake. There's been money put into removing turf, the rip to strip kind of deal. But one thing in our conservation projects we talk about the need for conservation in the M&I area, municipal and industrial area. But what we don't ever talk about, and I don't think anything's ever been addressed, and maybe I'm water that's conserved on a municipal level into the lake, rather than that water staying high in the reservoirs, assuming that it'll only get an excess amount down when the reservoirs spill. Because we're looking at trying to drive conservation at the municipal and industrial area, but is there any shepherding to try and get that to the lake, or is it, well, at the behest of the water districts, whether they want to release a little extra once in a while?
It's a great question, Leland. It is the parallel, it is the flip side of what we talked about in the agricultural sector. And it is also a problem and a challenge that we haven't figured out a way to do. And honestly, they focused on agriculture because they thought it'd be easier to handle. The reason it's easier to handle is it's tied to specific water rights. So if I work on a water rights project with an agricultural producer, then I can identify a block of water. I can figure out distribution, how it gets downstream. You think about when somebody saves some water, like if I save water, we flipped our strip at our house and removed, I think, about 700 square feet of turf this last year. That's tied up in the Dual Creek Irrigation Company's water right, which has contracts with the Weber Basin Water Conservancy District. So how in that context do you quantify my little thimble full of water and combine it with others to move downstream? But it is important. Why? One, the public expects it. Two, policymakers expect it. Why did the policymakers give $250 million for secondary metering? To augment water supply? To augment water in the reservoirs? In part, yes, but what was the real driver? Great Salt Lake. And so we have to find mechanisms to say where the state makes this massive investment money, how can we quantify the benefits? And I think there are creative ways to do that where you can get around the water rights challenges, but it's going to require the water districts to really work, I think, with the state to come up with ways to at least come up with proxies where they can release water. You know, they can hold water, but they can also release water strategically for the lake. There ought to be room for that, particularly where the state's made these huge investments.
You know, from the standpoint of, I've been on a board for a large water district, and without state guidance telling them they have to release some of that water, they're not going to.
No, because all the incentives are stacked the other way, right, Leland?
And so, you know, if there isn't some kind of, if you can, if we drive conservation, then if you look at it on a year-to-year basis, if we have a lot lower use this year, then there should be at least in theory,
I think we got to explore those things.
That's only going to happen at the legislature.
And we really should make, and I think this is becoming increasingly clear, you make headway in the wet years.
Right.
That's where you really make headway with the lake.
Another question or comment? Thank you, Tim. Appreciate that.
Thanks.
Brian, welcome. You want to take the podium? While you're coming up, I'll make a comment or two. We're delighted to have Brian Steed with us again. Many of you know him as the former director of the Department of Natural Resources. Following that, he moved north to head the Institute for Land, Air, and Water, which is based at the Utah State University. When the legislature created the position of Great Salt Lake Commissioner, Brian was appointed to that position. I think no one was surprised, and in fact, most people were quite pleased with that appointment. We've asked Brian to be here. He's got a busy schedule, so we really appreciate your being here, Brian, and giving us a report and an update on what you're doing and your strategy.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for the opportunity, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. So let's talk about where we are in terms of this strategy and how we got here. Last year during the legislative session, there was a new position created, the Great Salt Lake Commissioner position. That position was, well, I think it was intended for Tim Hawks, but he said no. And so I was the person that said yes to that. And in truth, it's been a rewarding job, but it's a challenging job. And there's a couple of things that were requested as of the commissioner's position. The first thing that they really needed out of the commissioner's position was a sense of where the state should be going when it comes to the Great Salt Lake and providing a strategy therein. So they asked us to craft a state strategy, have that to the governor's office for his review by November 30th. And so we took that upon ourselves. Before I get into the details of it, let's talk about the we here. I was appointed in May and confirmed in June or July. I don't remember which date it was. And then was able to hire Tim Davis. Tim, say hello. Who has been a great asset. So the Great Salt Lake Commission's team consists of exactly 2 people right now, which has been awesome. And then we got to put together the strategy. And the timing of the strategy was pretty lucky because the 30th, it had to be done. So Tim and I worked a lot over Thanksgiving to get that done. And then the next date on the strategy is it needs to be submitted to or approved by the governor's office on December 31st. That happened, and then it goes to the full legislature on January 15th. If you're tracking those dates, not only did we get to work over Thanksgiving, it also got us to where we got to work over Christmas and this weekend as well, which is great. We got 3 holidays in a row, and we're just knocking them down. And so good times are had by all. Let's talk about what's in the strategy and what's not in. Really, when looking at the Great Salt Lake, we know this is going to be much more of a marathon than a sprint. And accordingly, we have crafted a strategy that comes with 3 timeframes that we anticipate. The first timeframe is in the short term, and that's really considered to be over the next year. The next timeframe is the medium term, which is 1 to 5 years. And then the longer term we consider to be 6 to 30 years. And we can go through some of the things that are in that. So next slide, if you don't mind. Let's go talk about the short term. Next slide. So really, there's 4 categories of things that we're looking to do over the next year. First of all, we need to have improved coordination. We need to utilize the best available science. We need to get more water to the lake, and we need to make sure that we're protecting water and air quality. On improved coordination, let's go to the next slide. And let's actually go one more slide, if you don't mind, and then we'll go back to that one. So this has been on the website for some time, but one of the reasons we have the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office is because we really do have many, many state agencies that are engaged in efforts around the Great Salt Lake. There has been historically a fair amount of working together within those agencies, but there's been no central coordinator of those efforts. The Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office is set up to fulfill that role. And when you look at the various people that are around that circle, there's a lot of meaningful work being done. And this puts us in the middle of it. So the first step is better state-to-state coordination within, or better interstate coordination within the state itself. And that's something that we're looking to do over the next year to get better communications. One of the things we've immediately initialized is a weekly meeting with the various state agencies to make sure that we're all on the same page and we all understand what hand is doing vis-a-vis the other hand. And that's been very rewarding. Go back one, if you don't mind. Thanks. So not only between state agencies, though, we also need to have better engagement between the state and the federal government, which means we'll be working a lot with our federal partners in Bureau of Reclamation, USGS, as well as in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Army Corps of Engineers. So we're working on that and getting that set up as well. And then state-to-state coordination. There are 2 other states with interest in the Great Salt Lake, even though the Great Salt Lake is wholly confined within the state of Utah. The Bear River runs through both Idaho and Wyoming. And as a result of that, we really need to make sure that we're talking with them based on the contingencies of what might happen if we don't get the lake right. And what I mean by that is that the lake falling has certain consequences. We certainly see those consequences locally, but we also see potentially regulatory environments created as a result of a falling lake, whether that's through the Endangered Species Act or through clean air regulations. And if that happens at the federal scale, there's a possibility we bring in other states' interests as well in trying to solve the Great Salt Lake problem. So we really do need to have that state-to-state coordination. We are also encouraging coordination between regional water providers so that, to Leland's question, when we're talking with those regional water providers on how, we need to have better communication, and if we need to have more water released out of a reservoir, that we can actually have that conversation proactively and be aware of what's happening. We're also looking to have coordination with other important stakeholders like tribes and others that have various interests in the lake and making sure that we communicate effectively. This one may be of interest to you all. We are looking to have GSLAC as the council and not one of many councils dealing with the Great Salt Lake. We will be pushing for legislative changes potentially to say, there has been a proposal to have a watershed council in addition to GSLAC. We would like GSLAC to be the watershed council. We didn't ask for your permission on that. I apologize. But I will say this, having a clearinghouse, I think is really important for information. And I think GSLAC has established itself as kind of the go-to source. We would very much like to rely more on your ability to engage with the various stakeholders. Does that make sense? I got this weird stare from you, Mr. Leonard. It makes me nervous. But anyways, the next part is robust public engagement, because obviously it's going to take all of us to get this right. So that's what we're doing on improved coordination. Next slide. We also need the best available science. We have noticed as we've put together policy on the Great Salt Lake that we actually have some information that we need. We don't have other information that we might want. And so we're trying to get the best available science around. One thing we're pushing right now is a methodology for water use and data and improving that ability to measure how much water is being used. We need better monitoring of shrimp, flies, and birds. There are 2 right now because there's a really vested economic interest when it comes to the brine shrimp industry. Whereas with flies, brine flies, there have not been really a huge initiative on the state to track numbers. We think that it behooves us, based on the potential for listing of various species that rely on brine flies, to have more information regarding habitat needs and requirements, as well as numbers on what the flies are. And similarly, birds. If there is going to be a listing petition, it's very likely to involve bird species. And if that's the case, we probably want to have the best science available when it comes to that, and the best monitoring program regarding birds. We need to continue with the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan. One of the things that's very interesting about the establishment of the commission's role is that it came after we had a lot of things in process. One of the things that we had in process that's quite meaningful is the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan. We need that information. We have needed that information for a number of years. Unfortunately, a lot of the results don't come to bear until really 2026, sometimes even 2027. So we need to make sure that we're continuing those efforts. We glean whatever information we can over the next year from those efforts, but make sure that that keeps going and that is well coordinated. We are working with Forestry, Fire, and State Lands to update the comprehensive management plan, which hasn't been done in some time. And Ben or Marissa, you can tell me when the last time that was. 2013. So it's been a number of years, a decade. So updating that plan, I think, is really key. We will continue to work the work of the Great Salt Lake Strike Team. I just came from a data release with the Great Salt Lake Strike Team just a minute ago, just to try to get the research universities as well as the different agencies on the same playing field, as well as on the same projects, to make sure that we all are coordinating with one another about what we need to know and what we do know. So that's been, and then there's a variety of other studies that it's ongoing. Next slide, please. Getting more water to the lake. One of the things that we are encouraging is to set a target range for the lake. The work that's been done by Forestry, Fire, and State Lands and others going back to 2013 certainly established where we assume the lake is most healthy. We think that we need to be working towards that, and then we need to set a time frame for how we get there. And so one of the things that the strategy encourages and incorporates is setting that target range and time frame. The time frame we've chosen is over the next 30 years. There's a reason for that, because then when you look at the math on how much water it takes to get back to a target range of what we have identified as healthy, which is above 4198, then we're talking about a lot of water. In fact, if you look at the amount of water, by best guess, based on current conditions, we would assume that's about 471,000 acre feet per year of additional conservation, which is a lot. That even got Joe's attention. So it's something that we're working towards and making sure that we can get there. We also are encouraging a short-term contingency plan to keep above a floor of 4190. 4190 is well within the area that's been identified as having serious adverse conditions for the lake. We know that when we got down to that level during 2022, that we had issues with salinity as well as other issues along the way. So we would like to keep it above that floor, and we're having policy triggers or encouraging to have policy triggers in place for when we drop below that amount. Next, we need to really quantify the saved water from recent policy changes. We have done a ton of work in this space over a short time frame. That's to be commended, but we now need to do additional work in making sure that we understand and quantify the amount of water that's being saved. As then that goes similarly to the next, then if we are in fact saving water, then we probably want to have additional saved water transactions, meaning getting the saved water to the lake in places that it needs to be. We are encouraging, well, we intend to set up this year pilot programs for split season or seasonal leasing with the ag community. We also are encouraged that the state's continuing water augmentation through cloud seeding and would support that. And then finally, we really have to up our game when it comes to municipal and industrial optimization and conservation. We have done great things on the agricultural front. That's when we've invested pretty heavily as a state. We think that there needs to be policy implementing those same kind of changes at the local level, because how we grow is going to really impact the amount of water we have going forward. Next slide, please. And that just goes to show the where they are on the matrix and where we ended up. And you saw that in 2022, we ended up really well within that deep red. and that should be alarming to all of us, and that's something we would very much like to avoid. Next slide, please. In the short term, also, we need to make sure that we're protecting water and air quality. What that means is we really need to make sure that we have active salinity management in the South Arm. This has been something that's been we've been working on this year through berm management. I know that it's not without controversy. I can say this, berm management has did a tremendous job in reducing salinity levels in the South Arm over the last year. I know that Forestry, Fire, and State Land is working together with others to make sure that we understand what those operational rules ought to be on salinity, but it's something that we certainly should do. We need to make sure that we continue to monitor water quality generally. And then last but not least, as we've had a dry bed, that exposed lake bed has weathered and we have dust storms coming off of it, we are probably insufficiently programmed when it comes to monitoring on those events. So we need to make sure that we understand where the dust is coming from, where it's going, and what those impacts are. So we are promoting an expanded air quality monitoring program over the next year. Next slide. Moving on to, and there's just I think that's Joe Havase's favorite picture. I'm not sure. No? Okay, the next slide. The way forward, medium term, 1 to 5 years. Next slide. We are going to continue all effective short-term actions. Okay? Let me be very clear about this. This is an adaptive plan. I don't know that everything we are proposing to do is going to be what we need it to be. And so therefore, we are building into that we can change if we need to. So if things aren't working, we have the ability to change that. If things are working, we can keep those in place. Over that short time frame, or the medium term time frame, we really need to focus on completing and integrating the Great Salt Lake Integrated Management Plan into the policy fabric of the state. As I noted, we expect to have results on that in 2026, 2027. It provides hugely meaningful data and necessary data for management decisions, and we look forward to getting as many of those results as we can in the short term. Next, we know that we need to up our game on water conservation and land use planning over that 1 to 5 year time frame. Those really have to be married. We do live in an arid state, or a semi-arid state, I guess I should say. The fact that we live in a semi-arid state really has to be understood, and we need to plan for how we grow that way. We are not going to build a fence around the state and keep people out, but how we build out really does have big implications for how much water we will have and be able to have. So we will continue to work on water transactions, specifically through the establishment of more formal or more effective and more established water banking programs, as well as water markets through that time frame. And then Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, we're encouraging over them to do pilot projects on dust remediation just to see what that looks like. Just so you know, the Office of Legislative Audit General has done a research or a recent study identifying the threats to the state. One of the threats they identified was dust off of the lake. They've put a price tag on infrastructure, controlling that dust at $1.5 billion. And that's just infrastructure. And then an additional $15 million going forward every year just to maintain that infrastructure. It's a lot of money right now. And I would argue between us that that's probably on the very low end of where dust remediation efforts might go, just based on other conditions in other drying lake systems, whether that's the Salton Sea or Owens Lake or other systems around the world. So that's something that I think that we need to try, but also understand what the cost is going to be, et cetera. Based on costs, we also need to develop a long-term funding plan for all of these efforts. Because it's a marathon and not a sprint, it's going to take all of us, and it probably requires a funding plan that we are developing. And then last but not least, we need to explore potential water supply augmentation options. Long-term, and we'll just go real briefly on this one. 6 to 30 years, everything we said before, plus enhanced water conservation, land use planning, dust remediation, and then explore potential water supply augmentation. And that's the plan. So everything we've done that's effective, and that's what we're looking at. So any questions or thoughts? Friends?
Leland, you?
Sure. 15 years ago when we set up this council, one of the things that when we looked at all the management of the Great Salt Lake, we said is that we had great agencies all working in silos about how they do what they do. So I was very excited about the establishment of your office for the one ring to rule them all.
At least that makes one of us
Yeah.
that was excited about that. So,
So
yeah.
I'm hoping that you have more that help rule them all, but how are you going to force is the wrong word. How are you going to encourage all of the agencies, and I think some of them are trying more than others, to be proactive and work through your office before they take actions about things that they are entitled to take actions for under the statute, so that we make sure that they're in the best interest of the Great Salt Lake? I can give you examples, but there are a number of things where that may or may not be the case.
We don't want to point fingers. Listen, it's going to be a learning process. To your point, we've operated in those silos for some time as a state. Getting out of that habit is going to take a little bit of time, and we've been providing gentle and sometimes not so gentle reminders of how now the world is different and how now we have a coordinating office specifically so there's no surprises that way. We have been, and that's one of the reasons we set up this weekly briefing with the different agencies so that we are able to get ahead of that. In truth, I think that it's going to be, like I said, a work in progress for some time, but the statute does have some teeth for the commissioner's office. Those teeth I would prefer not to utilize on a punishment basis, but if we have to, we can do that too. Right now, that's not been the case, and I think that people are coming along, and I expect that to be the case going forward.
Thank you, Leland. Jeff?
Yeah, Commissioner, thank you for being here and appreciate all of your efforts. It certainly doesn't go unnoticed. I want to reference the South Shore areas of the Great Salt Lake. And again, I'm going to say this at every meeting, I think. The 15,000 acres of wetlands that are primarily devoted to duck clubs and preserved areas. We are the Great Salt Lake. I mean, we are an incredibly important function of the Great Salt Lake. You mentioned water. We talk about additional water to the Great Salt Lake. The one thing that doesn't get talked about that much is water quality, and I appreciate the fact that you mentioned it here today. We've seen over time a water quality issue, and if you think about the water that comes into all of that area in the Great Salt Lake, it comes from Utah Lake, goes down through all the way through the Jordan River, all the way through very heavily populated areas. And we have always acted as kind of the filter and kind of a sponge for that water before it gets to the Great Salt Lake. We've always been proud that we kind of act as that filter, and we've managed our properties accordingly. We have also, unfortunately, seen in the last few years, we've seen a very, very significant decline in submerged aquatic vegetation, and we are losing the quality of our wetlands, and it's happening very, I think, rapidly at this point. This last year, I want to say that it was kind of catastrophic, where we lost all of our sago pondweed and have lost probably nearly all of our submerged aquatic vegetation. It's just gone. Our filter may be full, and the ramifications of that may kind of cascade into the quality of brine shrimp production and other impacts on the ecosystem of the Great Salt Lake. I think I'm kind of raising an alarm bell that needs to be taken into consideration, and something needs to be done with that. We've been working pretty closely with Division of Water Quality, and they've been very, very supportive and helpful, and we're going to continue this year. But I just want to highlight that because I think it's something that has been subtly happening over years, but we're at a very critical point with water quality now. And we just ask for your support with water quality to do monitoring and what we need to figure out what's going on out there.
Absolutely. And Jeff, to your point, the wetlands are critically important. I don't think that we value the Great Salt Lake without the wetlands in the same way, right? The services that the wetlands provide are not to be underestimated. And understand that they're also in a perilous position. And so working very hard to make sure that when we talk about the Great Salt Lake, those attributes of the Great Salt Lake. So happy to work with you. Thanks.
Brian, I was interested to hear your comment on sort of combining the Great Salt Lake as a watershed council into GSLAC. Do you envision sort of an expansion of the role? Because I am involved in the West Desert Watershed Council, and there's, you definitely get more into the weeds, on certain things. And I guess, would you see a greater integration or interaction with Strike Team?
Yes. I think it has to be. And I think that having more of that, the ability to empower you all to do the jobs you can is part of what the envision or the vision would be. Also, I think there's some real danger in having two councils that report on the same thing. And having just a sole clearinghouse, I think, is extraordinarily important in this case. It helps us be on the same page.
My stare at you when you mentioned that issue was one of full support.
Okay.
I want to clarify that. Well,
I guess I just hadn't had I didn't know what it meant.
Well, I wanted to make sure I don't have to work on Thanksgiving and Christmas.
Thanks. Well, we're hoping you would. It's a great
Of course,
time.
I have many times.
I can tell you that if you have to do so, working with Tim is really pleasant. So, so for whatever that's worth.
All right, great. Randy, do you have a question? Go ahead.
Thank you. Hey, how is the commissioner's office going to interact with the Inland Port Authority? There's been a lot of stuff going on in the wetlands. Can you speak to that?
We have had a couple of meetings with them, and it's something I think that we absolutely do need to interact with them more and more formally. We just, if you looked at those series of circles around the Port Authority, I don't think is part of it. It needs to be part of it. So that's something we just need to increase. Tim, do you want to add anything to that? Yeah.
Howdy.
Hey, how are you?
Couple things. The target floor of 4190 seems scarily low. Just wanted to put that out there. Could you talk a little bit about that seasonal?
Sure.
One more thing as you go. The focus on the short-term actions that seem effective. Would Phragmites removal fall into that? And if so, how do we get funding to get more of that done?
Yeah. So Phragmites is in the report as something that's important. You want to add anything, Tim?
There is an action item specifically in the report in the short term, and it's under the getting water to the lake for continued and expanded Phragmites removal with the divisions of forest, fire, and state lands and water wildlife resources.
And to your answer on how we get more money for that, that's one of the conversations we're having with our federal partners, because the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a tremendous interest in that, because getting rid of Phragmites actually provides better habitat for those migratory waterfowl. And so it's something we will continue to work with them on. As to the other question, remind me what it was. Oh, seasonal leases, seasonal and split season. One of the things when you look at who's using water within the Great Salt Lake watershed, you'll see that the largest user is agricultural interests. We think we have to work with them as partners on this process, and they can't be perceived for themselves to be on the table. They've got to be at the table. Does that make sense? So this is something that we're working with them on. Split season leases is something that we have passed through legislation, but we really haven't tried yet in a great way. And I'll give you the example of why we're interested in this. Two things. First of all, when we talk about agricultural optimization, many of those things have a substantial reduction in diversions, but in some cases, those diversions have remained in a canal, right? And then it's become available to other secondary water users. We just got to get beyond that. So what we would do is go in and say, listen, we will pay for a particular user, not, so if you, let's say it's alfalfa, just as a for instance, no targets on alfalfa. If you were to say, hey, you get 4 cuts of alfalfa annually, your best 2 cuts are generally your first and second cut, right? What if we paid you not to water for the 3rd and 4th cut? And then we make sure that water is shepherded to the lake, and that's something to do. In terms of the seasonal leases, this is something that we're considering as well, because when you look at even alfalfa, one of the real values of alfalfa is the fact that you can leave it in the ground and until multiple years in a row. That actually has huge ecosystem service benefits from, I mean, no-till agriculture is something that people are promoting a lot of places, not just in alfalfa. Even alfalfa has a rotational scheme sometimes though, to where when people remove it, what if you were able to say, listen, let's say it's a 7-year rotation where you generally have kept your alfalfa in the ground 7 years. What if on the 8th year, rather than tilling and replanting, we pay you that year not to farm, right? Or not to do that rotation. Both of those things provide real water. And if we can shepherd to the lake, they can actually provide real water to the lake without harming agriculture's interests. And we think there's some real value in that.
Thank you, Jeffrey. One more.
Okay. All right. I don't know if you can still pull up your presentation. The very last slide, it kind of skipped over, but you had a bullet point about interbasin water sharing. Can you talk a little bit more about that, since there's a lot of less water throughout the West right now?
So it's something that we have been strongly encouraged to pursue from the legislature and looking for those other sources of water. I can't prognosticate on the availability of that. I can tell you that every state in the West is currently seeking for an additional source of water, regardless of where that is. And just by way of anecdote, I was at the Colorado River Water Users Association conference a few weeks back in Las Vegas, and ran into a friend of mine who I used to work with in the federal government, who now works in North Dakota. And I was like, Karua, why are you here? And my friend from North Dakota says, we're making sure that you all are not coming for our water. Right? And I think that's an anecdote, but I think it's interesting just to show that there's a lot of interest, but there's also a lot of interest on the other side as well. And so that's something that we will be looking at. We haven't identified any particular targets, but it's something we have been asked to look at going forward. And the reason it ends up in the long-term frame, because even if that were to come to fruition, there are no short-term available water in that sense. There's really not water available in the medium term either. And so if you look at long-term, let's say hydrology changes west-wide, and for whatever reason, people have a surplus of water, maybe it's easier. I don't know. I can't prognosticate, but I can say we know that that's going to be a lot of work if it happens. And that's why, being very candid with you all, why we focus on what we can control right now. And what we can't control right now are our own behaviors. Our own behaviors, meaning we can conserve more, we can do more locally, and by doing those things, we can actually get more water to the lake in the shorter term.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate very much your being here and all the great work you're doing. And thank you for working holidays, and hopefully that'll end.
I wouldn't have it any other way. Don. Thanks.
I know that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Mr.
Okay,
Chair, there's
next
a
on our
hand
agenda-
raised. You have a hand
Oh, I'm
raised?
sorry. Jan, can we take one more question from Jan Streifel online? Go ahead, Jan.
Jan always asks the hardest questions. I don't know if I want this.
I was trying to.
Okay, I'm
Fine.
here.
Okay.
Maybe this is just a comment, but I was thinking about the Great Salt Lake enhancement projects and the prioritization process that the council may be going through. And it seems like the focus should be on the short-term projects in the strategic plan. And I just wanted to somehow find a way to connect those two, so we're accomplishing some goals.
That's an excellent point, Jan, and Tim can chime in on that.
Yeah, thanks, Jan. That is very much what I would say my role in the commissioner's office is, to go figure out all those moving parts and how to bring them together under the strategic plan and really focus, make sure we're all pulling in the same direction. And that's where Brian and I are focused on. We needed to get the strategic plan done and then start to look at the project list, start to look at the basin integrated plan and others, and pull that, make sure we're all pulling in the same direction. So thanks for that comment.
Thank you. Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Next item on our agenda is public comment. Or is there anyone who has a desire to make a public comment? Hearing none, we'll move on. We have no formal actions to take today. I'd encourage council members to contact Marissa or myself if you have suggestions for topics for our meetings or studies. Before we conclude, I see we have a couple of minutes. I wonder if you would allow me to make a couple of personal comments. I've been before when the brine shrimp industry retained me to help them bring some order to the industry. There was great conflict among the companies as well as between the companies in the state. And the result of that is I had the opportunity of working with former DWR director Dan, or what was his name? Yeah, Bob Valentine, sorry, Bob Valentine. And we were able to create a regulatory scheme for the industry and for the brine shrimp resource that included the creation of the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Project, the establishment of what we call the brine shrimp rule, and the creation of the technical advisory group to oversee research regarding the brine shrimp resource. In 2006, I helped bring together the Great Salt Lake Brine Shrimp Cooperative and served the past 17 years as the chairman of the cooperative. 14 of those years, I also served as the CEO of the cooperative. In 2009, when Governor Huntsman created a committee to look at how we could create some structure to preserve and protect the Great Salt Lake, I was pleased to be able to serve on that group, and we had some great recommendations, but Governor Huntsman decided to go be ambassador. It occurred on our committee, and we ended up with in a bill that would create the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council without staff, without funding, without regulatory authority. There are a lot of people who are disappointed, but under Leland's leadership as our first chair, we were able to focus on doing things that could influence the debate in positive ways, I think. If that sounds like a resume, it is a little bit. One thing I'd add, if that were a written resume, even though it's illegal to do so, I recently turned 72 years old, and I have 15 grandchildren, some dusty golf clubs, a new pickleball paddle, and a lot of books I'd like to read. And so, effective January 1 of this year, I stepped down as chair of the Brine Shrimp Cooperative, and Tim Hawks assumed that position. You all know Tim? And Tim is now the chairman of the Great Salt Lake Brine Shrimp Cooperative, in addition to being the general counsel for the cooperative. My term on the advisory council ends in June of, excuse me, June of 2026. And there's no requirement for me to be employed at the cooperative to stay with the council. But I think the time is right for me to step down and for Tim Hawks to take my place on the advisory council. And so I just wanted to inform you, excuse me, that I intend to formally resign from the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council effective the day that Tim is confirmed by the Senate to finish my term. I've enjoyed working with all of you. I appreciate the support and the interaction. I think we've done some good things and hope you can continue to do more great things. And I appreciate being able to work with you, and just wanted you to hear from my mouth why I was stepping down and what was going to happen. I'll assume that clapping was because I finished my statement. Thank you, all of you. Is there any other business to come before the advisory council? Our next meeting will be Wednesday, March 13th from 10 to 11:30 in the morning. I want to remind you that we're not having a May meeting because it would conflict with the Great Salt Lake Issues Forum, and we'll encourage you all to participate in that forum. And then we'll reconvene after that for our July meeting. Any other questions, comments, business? I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Thank you, Leland. Is there a second? Thank you, Joe. Any debate or discussion? All in favor, say aye.